In light of the Polish incursion, actually in light of the Russian incursion with drones into Polish airspace that happened a few days ago, lots of things have been happening since that time. And Europe is seeming to get a lot more aggravated and a lot more boisterous in trying to change the dynamic on the ground and in the air. And they seem to be losing their patience. One of the things that has been at the forefront of this from the European side, especially with Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and Mr. Merz from Germany, is this reassurance force, this coalition of the willing. Many people have been saying, okay, yeah, that's fine as far as it goes, but Russia will never agree to that. So there won't be a negotiated settlement if that's the case, if that's part of the deal. So it's all a bunch of nonsense. Well, some in Europe are now saying, you know what? We shouldn't wait for that point. We should do something earlier than that and send our troops into Europe before, or into Ukraine before that time. And to try and break down all of this and what's going on, we are absolutely delighted today to have back with us Patrik Baab, who's one of Germany's most critical international journalists, the author of the best-selling book On Both Sides of the Front, where he shares his experiences traveling in the Donbass. He worked for many years as an editor of North German Broadcasting Company, NDR, and also was a lecturer at 2 different universities. Mr. Baab, welcome back to the show. Good to have you back.
Hello, Daniel. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, listen, I always appreciate your view because as a journalist and as someone who has experience on both sides of the line, that you have a pretty good perspective that few have, because you don't seem to be worried about just sharing the slanted viewpoint of one side or the other, but of actually getting down to the bottom line and the truth of it. And I think that's going to be really important in today's show because, and just kind of to set the stage, I just wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your impressions now that we have a few days under our belt of what actually happened when these allegedly 19 drones, and by the way, I've still only seen physical evidence of maybe 3 of them, but the claim is that 19 drones went from Russia into Polish airspace and were then shot down. What do you know?
That's the claim. But I'm really unsure on that, because there is evidence that this could have been a false flag operation by the Ukraine Secret Service. First of all, the numbers of the drones given us by Polish officials are completely unclear. Sometimes they are talking about 7 to 9 drones, then they are talking about 19 drones. They don't know how many drones. And the house, which was possibly destroyed by drones, was destroyed some weeks earlier. And the Russian drones of that kind have a range of 700 kilometers, let me say 550 miles. But to come into Poland, they must have a range of 1,000 miles, and this is impossible. So I think this was a false flag operation of the Ukraine Secret Service. But this is not discussed in Germany, only in small minorities. It is discussed as a Russian aggression in the mainstream media. And having in mind that the mainstream media are part of a propaganda and censorship complex of state institutions, universities, think tanks, government-organized, non-government organizations, and so on, they want to probably create a reason to bring NATO forces closer to the Russian frontier. And so the situation in Europe, in Northern Europe, is getting more dangerous, because I think that NATO wants to widen the range of the Ukraine war and to bring the Baltic Sea, Scandinavia, and the Baltic region into this war. So we are close to a NATO provocation to start a wide-range war, a full-scale war against Russia. But
okay, so let me ask you on that, because I not listening to anybody's words, but just looking at the actions, that's plausible, what you say there. But I mean, surely these guys throughout the European countries and NATO at large are realizing what the consequences of that would be. If you got into a conflict with Russia, I mean, surely they know we don't have the infrastructure, the defense industrial base across the entire alliance, to include the United States, that could match what Russia already has and is continuing to grow. It seems like that it would be a very, very catastrophic thing, which all too easily could go nuclear. What is the thinking behind this as far as you can identify?
Well, I want to start with an information. I visited Russia last time in June, and I made a trip up there to Karelia. And I saw that the Russian nuclear forces are building up their rocket stations over there, their missile stations over there. And so the situation is getting more and more dangerous on both sides. And I think that European elites don't follow the interest of their own people and their own country, which is an interest of survival at first hand. They are following the interests of the United States. And the background is these elites are mostly involved in transatlantic organizations like, of course, in Germany, the German Marshall Fund, National Endowment for Democracy, the Soros Foundations, and all that. So we can speak of transatlantic corrupted elites in Europe.
Well, and who's to argue that it's not a lot of corruption going on? But even corrupt officials would seem to be drawing a line when it comes to potentially setting up an existential condition which they would lose or lose big. How is that not factoring into their thinking?
Yes, I'm not in their brain and I'm not in their mind. And this is my explanation. Transatlantic corrupted elites who lost ground of reality. They think Russia wouldn't be so aggressive that they would start a nuclear war with NATO. But I think, according to my information, this is exactly what Mr. Putin told Mr. Trump at their meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, that the Russian Federation is ready to start a nuclear war in Europe, because this Ukraine war is, for the Russians, for the Kremlin, a war of decision. It's all in because they don't want to have American missiles 500 kilometers away from Moscow. And for America, this is a war of choice. This is a different approach. And now the Americans, the Trump administration, is successfully trying to Europeanize this war. The Europeans should go into war as a proxy war. The Ukrainians bleed it out, and now the Germans and the British should go in.
And that seems to be happening. Gary, if you could play the comment from Secretary of State for Defense John Healey, because he was talking about how, yes, we are definitely sending hardware, military aircraft into this Eastern Century, which is the NATO response to what allegedly happened with the Russian drone incursion.
I'm confirming that within days, British fighter jets and a air-to-air tanker behind us will be part of NATO's new airspace mission to defend the eastern flank against the Russian incursions, the Russian actions which have been so reckless and dangerous and unprecedented in recent days. They'll be part of a NATO air mission alongside the Germans, the Danes, the French, and it reinforces NATO's eastern flank in the face of Putin's actions. And the message to Moscow is clear. Putin tested NATO, NATO responded with unity, and the UK will play our full part.
Now that, just seems odd on the surface of it, because the most plausible public analysis of what happened was when you look at the sequence of events, Belarus actually warned Poland ahead of time when they saw apparently these drones that were flying through their airspace that were heading in the direction of Poland. They gave them some advance warning. Poland, according to what they have said, Gary, if you can put that full screen media report up on the screen, Poland is saying that was actually helpful. The Belarusians warned us that drones were heading towards us through their airspace, Polish General Kugula said, adding that Poland accepted the tip-off and reciprocated by sharing information about the objects flying towards Belarus. It was good that the Belarusians passed along information about objects heading towards Poland because it in some way helped our air defense. At the same time, we got confirmation that these were Russian drones, but in this way, they had only washed their hands, etc. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me at all, just on the surface of it, that Belarus, who's obviously as close to an ally as you can get of Russia in this, even though their troops aren't participating, but they're diplomatically linked at the hip practically, that they're going to see that Russia wanted to test the airspace of Poland with unarmed drones, by the way, and that then they would warn them ahead of time, and at least according to one report I saw, actually shot down a couple of the drones. What do you make of that?
First of all, the Belarusian officials acted very fairly. They informed the Polish officials and the Polish army that there is a possible danger. But there was no danger at all. These drones didn't wear much explosives. Nothing was found. And I think that the Belarusian officials, the Belarusian army, was unsure about the origin of these drones. So I cannot say more. I cannot talk about the games in the background. I have no further information on that. But one thing is very clear, the situation in the Baltic area, in Central Europe, is becoming more and more dangerous.
It is, and you know, and I also, I mean, I have no direct or any kind of sources that have said anything that this was a false flag. But the problem is, when even what's known, it becomes, if not bizarre, really questionable that if there was a diversion of these drones, and by the way, there's also the plausibility that Ukrainian electronic warfare actually jammed the signals of these, and that's what caused them to not fly to their intended course, but just to fly until basically they ran out of fuel and they just dropped wherever they were, like in fields and whatnot. That would not by itself prompt a military response from the NATO side, because they would understand that Russia obviously wasn't intending to attack Poland, because that would draw in the alliance, Article 5 and all that. And nobody would want to fight a war against one side and then say, yeah, let me just draw the other side in for no gain to me and everything to lose. So it's irrational to do that. And yet you see with Mr. Healy there, they are actually putting a lot of effort into, and Germany was one of those mentioned in there, that's going to send some fighters to the Eastern Front. Can you tell us anything about what the German participation might be?
So, from my point of view, the coalition of the willing, and Mr. Merz, our chancellor, is part of the coalition of the willing, wants to go deeper and deeper into this war. And they need good reasons to explain that to their own people. They want to go into this war because for the Europeans, this war in Ukraine became a kind of bloody delay of bankruptcy. They are bloody bankrupt. We are discussing an intervention of the International Monetary Fund in Great Britain, in the UK, or in France. The situation in Germany, in terms of the financial situation, is not as bad, but it is bad. And Germany is running deeper and deeper in a kind of industrial decline. So our leaders pressed their own countries into a dead end street. And now they don't find out of that. They cannot go back. And the only way forward is a way to war. I think we will get a war against Russia in the next years. They are looking for creating some reasons for that. And one important point is German the German people, most Germans, the majority of Germans, are sleeping into their own abuse. And that's the point.
Now
We are a country without any opposition.
That's a pretty stark statement there, that you think that we're going to get the war we're searching for. And if we needed any more justification or any more reason to be alarmed, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson provided it in a pretty angry interview that he had here of late. And one of the questions that he was asked was, this whole coalition of the willing that you mentioned there just a second ago. He's saying, that's kind of a waste of time, because that presupposes that there's an agreement that both sides have agreed to, and only then would there come in this coalition. And the Russians are already saying categorically they won't agree to such a term. So he said it's a bunch of nonsense. So he suggests maybe we should try a different approach.
You need something that's going to flip a switch in the Kremlin's brain and make them realize that fundamentally, strategically, this is over. Ukraine is an independent country. And although they may be impossible, it may be impossible to get Putin out of the bits he currently occupies, the cost of trying to get the rest is going to be too great. And it's pointless, because the West has asserted its commitment. And the way for the West to assert its commitment would be to say, well, the coalition of the willing will start to arrive. And they won't. Of course, they're not going to fight the war. The Ukrainians are much better than Western Europeans at fighting the war. They're not going to go into harm's way. They're going to They're going to do logistics. They're going to do training. They're going to do whatever to backfilling is useful. But fundamentally, they're going to be there to make the point that Ukraine decides what military forces come to Ukraine, not Russia.
That's is nearly as bizarre as it can get. I guess with Boris Johnson, it could get a little bit more bizarre, but that's pretty close to the limit right there. When you say they're not going to be fighting, they're going to be doing logistics or whatever, but their presence will make the point and scare Russia, as he said at the beginning of the clip, into calculating that the war can't be won. That logic is almost directly contradictory to its own ends. What do you make of that?
Well, this statement of Boris Johnson shows that Western elites lost the ground of reality completely, because the reality on the front line is completely different to that. Russian troops, the Russian army is getting forward and forward, and they are getting stronger and stronger. They have at least 700,000 Russian soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine losses grew to a level of 1.7 million dead soldiers and casualties. So Ukraine is bleeding out, and Russia is winning the war. And the only way to peace is to meet the Russian demands. That means a neutral Ukraine, a regime change to a Russian-friendly government in Kiev, and security for the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, rights for minorities. And the 4 oblasts will stay Russian, part of the Russian Federation. And the chief negotiator at the last talks in Istanbul between the Russian side and the Ukraine side, Medvedev, told the Ukraine partners, next time we don't talk about 4 oblasts, we will talk about 8 oblasts. And that's the reality on the ground. So Ukraine will be divided, and Western leaders don't want to accept that. Their hope is that the Ukraine side and the Ukraine front line will be stable for 2 or 3 or 4 more years. And then they hope that their own armies are strong enough to help the Ukrainians on the ground, to invade Ukraine. And this would lead into a direct confrontation. And the first step of this direct confrontation would be peace troops of NATO countries into Ukraine. This is something the new President of the UN as a General Assembly, Annalena Baerbock, voted for to bring, by a votum of the United Nations, new peace troops, Western peace troops into Ukraine. And from the Russian side, this is unacceptable and would lead in a direct confrontation and a full-scale war in Europe.
Well, that's not an encouraging thing, but again, we have to say that the evidence seems to move in that direction. And in fact, I told you that Boris Johnson was pretty close to delusional there. Well, I think he went the rest of the way when he was asked by the reporter, well, yeah, but what about the Russian response? Because Russia has said categorically, no, if any Western troops come into Ukraine without our authorization, they're fair game and we will attack them militarily. They are absolutely, unequivocally on record directly saying that. And yet, here's Boris Johnson's answer.
Well, who's put foreign troops on Ukrainian soil? There's only one country that's put foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, and that's Russia. They don't want foreign troops on Ukrainian soil. I got a brilliant idea. They bog off.
They are insistent on European and US troops not being here, though. But do you think that's because they are scared of that?
It's for the very reason I give. It's because they can see that this is not about territory. This is about destiny. And the point I'm trying to make with my suggestion is that you've got to show them that the destiny the Ukrainians have chosen is irrevocable. And they've chosen to be part of the Western security architecture, however you want to express it. They're going to be part of that family. That doesn't mean they're ever going to be threatening to Russia, but that's what they want. They don't want to be part of the Russian Empire.
I mean, Russia has laid down multiple red lines all throughout the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and Europe has had the courage to cross them with like tanks, F-16s and everything. Is foreign troops just another red line, and does Europe just need to have the courage to cross it?
Get on with it. Get on with it.
Of course, get on with it. Bring those troops in. Russia won't do a thing. They've said that. Sure, they actually invaded Ukraine in 2022 when they said they would, but forget about that. They don't mean what they say, so let's just get on with it. This seems to fall into the category of what you just described of being maybe even a desire for conflict. I mean, is there a way to argue around that?
Yes, and the speech, the answers of Boris Johnson are a long row of lies. And I think he believes in his own lies. I want to mention a sentence of the American professor and world-famous economist Jeffrey Sachs. According to him, French President Macron told him that NATO was completely responsible for Ukraine war and led us into this war, not the Russians. According to Jeffrey Sachs, in the words of Macron, the Russians are reacting. And there is some evidence for that. The first element is this war did not start in February 2022. This war started in February 2014 with the Western organized coup on Maidan in Kiev. And now we have a right-wing and ultra-nationalist, fascist government in Kiev, which is not acceptable by the Russian Federation. And this ultra-nationalist government tried to suppress the Russian minority in eastern Ukraine. And what Boris Johnson told us, that the Ukrainian people made a decision to go to the West. This is completely not right. The people in Ukraine want peace on both sides of the front line. I heard that on both sides. They want peace. And the rest is not so important for them. And I heard very often in eastern Ukraine, eastward of Donbas, of the Dnieper River, well, we want peace, but the only way to peace for us is on the side of Russia and the Russian army because we were suppressed. We were under fire for more than 8 years. We lost our children. We had so many dead people right here. And we cannot accept that the Ukrainian army and the coup government is killing us. We cannot accept that. And a way of survival, the only way of survival for those people is on the side of Russia. And this is something I heard very often in the eastern part of the country. And this is something Western elites don't want to accept.
Well, they certainly don't. It doesn't look like they're going to anymore. So you have Boris Johnson, who, by the way, obviously is not in power, but he is enormously influential and definitely connected to those who are in power, both in UK and throughout the West. So you can't just dismiss his words as though he's just some commentator. But then you also have to look at what others are saying who are connected. There was an interview in Kiev over the weekend where Niall Ferguson was interviewing Keith Kellogg. And Keith Kellogg said, and again, he's the handpicked envoy for President Trump in all these negotiations. And then he said, Russia is actually losing this war, by the way. Sure, they've taken a few meters here and there, but then he rattled off this whole little list of things about why actually no, Russia is not winning. And somehow he never actually got to how Ukraine could win. But don't worry about that. Bottom line is that Russia is losing. That's the important thing. So we got to keep going is the bottom line. Well, in a separate interview, I think it was the day after that, Niall Ferguson himself was interviewed, and he's saying that we need to keep going because NATO credibility is at stake.
NATO risks becoming a laughingstock if it does not respond credibly to the threat of Russian aggression against NATO members. And I'm disappointed in the response that we've seen since Polish airspace was violated. I think it's a mistake on the part of President Trump to dismiss this as some kind of error. You don't commit an error for hours on end, and the Russian drones were in Polish airspace for many hours. I think it's also concerning that they weren't all shot down.
I mean, at the risk of redundancy, I mean, you just see comment after comment after comment that keeps that theme of we're not doing enough militarily. We've got to keep going more to force Putin to understand that this is not something that he can win, et cetera. And yet, do you see any evidence on the Russian side of this that they are equivocating, that they're saying, golly, there's so much pressure here, maybe we better pull back and stop?
No, absolutely not. But in one point, he was absolutely right. NATO is losing its face if Russia will win the war. That's very clear, because worldwide, everybody can see that NATO was not strong enough to bring Russia on its knees. But Russia is backed by China and India as well, and by the BRICS states, and by the majority of the countries in the United Nations General Assembly. More than 150 countries are dealing with Russia and continuing dealing with Russia. So that means in Ukraine war is focusing a worldwide struggle between the unipolar world led by the United States and those forces and those countries who want to achieve a multipolar world. And the policy of the United States is pressing China and Russia closer and closer together. And in Beijing, nobody is interested that Russia will lose this war because they don't want an American influenced state in their north. And they need Russia as a mineral storage for their future. So both partners have problems with each other, but Western policy is pressing those partners and the Indian government as well together. And because they don't want to see that Western countries led by the United States will lead the future world. They don't want to have it. And this Ukraine war is a fight of decision for both sides. And both sides cannot step back. The Russians cannot step back. It is a war of survival for them. And the NATO don't want to step back because financial capitalism is in a crisis and they need new collateral to make this financial capitalistic system stable. And this collateral are Ukraine minerals and possibly in the future Russian minerals. They want to kick open the door to the Russian minerals. They want access for cheap money. And that's the background of the whole conflict.
Well, they may want that, but then there's a matter of being able to get it and still survive, and that's a much more problematic calculation to make, which doesn't look like they're even doing the math necessary to achieve that objective, but that's never stopped them before. And there's one more element in this that I want to point out there. I mean, I've mentioned what the United States is doing, what NATO is doing, and specifically the UK, et cetera. But there's another actor that's obviously very important in this, and that is Ukraine. Now, there was reports in the U.S. media today that President Zelenskyy is going to be meeting with President Trump very soon to really push the case that to release the likes of Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal, get these bone-crushing sanctions on the books and these other sanctions, tariffs against the others who've been using Russian oil, et cetera. And there was a speech made, an excellent interview with Zelenskyy that he made earlier today. And as a public service, we're going to warn people that this soundbite from Zelenskyy is coming up. So just bear with that. But here's what he had to say.
It's very important not to give Putin this space, because otherwise he won't feel that compelled that he has to stop the war. Because why? I mean, if he's fighting, if he's waging the war, and everyone is trying to stop him by arguing, by asking him, but instead, force should be used. He understands force. That's his language. That's the language he understands. He doesn't speak many languages, but that's the language of force he understands, just like Russian, you know, his mother tongue. And we ask very much our countries, European and US countries, to do that, to show that. Yes, they take steps, such as sanctions, for example, but more needs to be done.
So whether Zelenskyy is a useful idiot and he's just playing the role of all these British folks and all these other Europeans that we just mentioned here who seem to be wanting to press this forward, or whether he's just saying, hey, I want to draw you guys in, can't really say. But it does seem that all of the Europeans and the Ukraine side are on the same sheet of music, pushing, as you say, to the potential war with Russia.
So Mr. Zelenskyy is speaking in his own interest, because one thing is very clear: the end of Ukraine war would be the end of the politician Zelenskyy. Probably his life would be at stake, because he's surrounded by neo-fascists, by Ukrainian neo-fascists, who are controlling the whole security apparatus. And the political survival of those people is continuing with this war. This is the only way. And continuing this war means they try again and again to bring NATO directly into this war. This is the reason why I talked about a false flag operation with those drones. And he's trying and trying again. On the other hand, Mr. Trump started with the promise to his voters to stop this war in 24 hours. And now we see this was impossible. And I think that Mr. Trump and the Trump team is losing the fight against the American deep state, grounded in the CIA, the Foreign Office, the whole administration. And large parts of the American elites want to continue with this war to make money through this war, especially the financial industry. So Mr. Trump is not strong enough to stop this war, but he promised that to his voters. So he made a kind of deception. He told his voters, okay, we are going to Europeanize that war. The Europeans are paying and are playing this game. We are drawing back. But in the end of the show, the Americans are deeply involved because all satellite information, drone information, surveillance information is getting to the Ukrainians. And this war is orchestrated by American generals in Germany's town Wiesbaden. So the Americans are deeply involved, but this is a game of deception for Mr. Trump's voters.
Well, and in fact, you mentioned President Trump. One has to wonder whether it's Trump who's deceiving the voters or maybe even deceiving himself. Here's what he said on Sunday about his view on still getting this settled in some good way.
I want to stop the killing. So it just came out, or I think it came out, but I know for a fact, almost 8,000 young soldiers died this week between the two countries. A little bit more from Russia, but divided. You know, when you're the aggressor, you lose more. I don't know if you know that, but in war, when you're the aggressor, you tend to lose more. But it was a little bit more for Russia, but it was 8,000, a little bit more than 8,017, actually, died this week in that war. Why? And they're Russians. They're not American soldiers, but they're still human beings. They're souls. And I want to stop them. And, you know, I stopped 7 wars. I thought this was going to be an easy one for me, but this has turned out to be tough. The hatred between Zelenskyy and Putin is unfathomable.
Do you still believe that they will talk? That they will have a...
I don't know. I think I'm going to have to do all the talking. They hate each other.
When do you think that will take place?
I don't know. Relatively soon.
Has any of the NATO...
We're going to get it worked out one way or the other, but relatively soon.
Has any of the NATO...
They hate each other so much, they can't breathe.
I mean, he keeps talking about how much they hate each other, but we're going to get this done. He keeps saying that. Of course, he's been saying that ever since he came into office last January. He used to set a bunch of deadlines. First 24 hours that you put, then 100 days, and then 50 days, and then 10 days, and then a couple of weeks, and all of those passed without any consequence. So now he's just kind of saying relatively soon. But can anyone have any hope at all that he's going to do anything?
Well, firstly, I'd like to take Mr. Trump seriously. And then I have some questions. Why, if you want to stop the killing, as he said, why doesn't he stop the flow of information, of satellite information and surveillance information to the Ukrainian army? Secondly, why doesn't he stop the activities of the CIA in the Ukraine and stop the stay-behind war in the area of Multipolar in the Russian-controlled area? Thirdly, why doesn't he stop the organizing and controlling and orchestrating of the war by American troops based in Wiesbaden, Germany? And the fourth point, why doesn't he stop the weapons shipping to Ukraine? Easy questions, and he should answer these questions. And then this would enforce his credibility. But at the moment, the American president doesn't have any credibility for me.
Well, and it's hard to, if you keep saying you want to end the war and yet you don't use any leverage at all over the Ukraine side where we have the most ability, as you just articulated 4 points right there. And I thought that was really illuminating with that ultimatum that he sent not to Russia, but to NATO over the weekend. The letter was literally addressed to NATO, saying, look, we're ready to do these big sanctions, but only if you do them first. And if you cut off all your oil sales. What I wonder if you could speak on that one issue right there, because I think the number is between 15 and 20%, 15 and 19%, something like that, of the oil that Europe gets at large. And I think Slovakia and Hungary are the biggest 2 users of that. What would happen if they complied with that and had an instant cutoff to zero? What would be the impact on those countries?
Well, European economies will lose their competitiveness more and more and stronger and stronger. That's the point. And Mr. Trump wants to bring European economies in a kind of complete slavery to the United States. They want to sell LNG to the European countries, which is very expensive and cannot used successfully by the European companies, especially by the German companies. Germany needs Russian gas and Russian minerals and needs the relationship to Russia. And Mr. Trump knows exactly that he can kick out the European economies out of the business. So this makes the American economy stronger and the European economy weaker. And that's the background. He wants to bring us Europeans into a stronger form of slavery.
Wow. Well, that's a pretty troubling statement there. So it would appear that at least according to your interpretation there, that the United States has more than one interest in this, and maybe it's not really in ending the war, but in having it perpetuated. So do you contend that Trump's interest is in just letting the war fester as it is without getting more involved, whereas the Europeans seem to be wanting the war not just to fester, but to actually accelerate into a conflict with Russia? Because it doesn't look like Trump actually wants that part. How do you see those two potentially contradictory Western objectives fitting together?
Yeah, Mr. Trump wants to focus on another enemy, and that is China. And the European allies, or would be better to say the European vessels, should shoulder the fighting against Russia on Ukraine's soil. And that's the background. This is a way of deception. And well, the American government wants to start and to continue with this proxy war in Ukraine. So this is really pessimistic, and transatlantic corrupted elites in Europe are doing that. They want to do this job. I cannot say more. It's well, this is the hard game.
Yeah, it is, and it's really hard to dispute. But I want to end though, and looking at the other component of this more directly, because you have to look at the whole thing in comprehensive total to try to understand where this could be going, and that is on the Russian side. It's whereas if Trump is talking in that last soundbite there about wanting to end this quickly, and I want to get together very soon so that we can get in the room together and then find this war to get the killing to stop, etc. Russia, on the other hand, just saying, we're not in that much of a hurry.
This unprecedented number of sanctions that have been imposed against our country over the past, well, one can say, almost 4 years already, have had no effect, and they have proven to be absolutely useless in terms of putting pressure on Russia. Russia consistently welcomes the point of view repeatedly voiced by the head of our state that it would be preferable for us to achieve our goals and ensure our security by political and diplomatic methods. But at a time when this is impossible due to the lack of reciprocity on the part of European states, on the part of the Kyiv regime, we continue a special military operation. And no sanctions will be able to force the Russian Federation to change this consistent position, which our president has repeatedly spoken about. We intend to continue moving in line with the peacekeeping efforts that the United States of America, President Trump personally, is making.
And just a couple of days ago, Peskov again added that, look, it's going to take some time to do. There has to be a lot of work done behind the scenes. So we're effectively in a pause. I think that's what he said on Monday. He said, so we'll just have to wait and see how it's going to go. But in the meantime, we're continuing on the special military operation. So what does that tell you about what Russia intends and how they plan to counter this potential for the West wanting to spark a wider war?
Well, the spokesman of Mr. Putin found clear words. And he's not known as for being a liar. And I can say I visited Russia several times, and I visited Ukraine several times, and I can say the sanctions, they have a result. They made the Russian economy stronger by standing on its own feet. And sanctions don't meet the intended goal when more than 150 countries in the General Assembly of the United Nations continue to deal with Russia. And they do it in their own interest because a lot of African states need Russian agriculture exports to feed their own people. They must deal with Russia. And the Chinese have no interest to stop their deals with Russia. They need Russian minerals, Russian gas, and oil to fair prices. And the building of the pipeline, Power of Siberia 2, will turn around and lead the gas which should get to Europe one day to China. And this makes China stronger, and this makes Russia stronger. But this is an investment of billions of dollars. So the turning around the pivot to Asia is not stoppable because it is linked to so huge investments that they must make money with these pipelines. And the Russians make by new icebreakers, nuclear-driven icebreakers, the northern route skippable all over the year. And this cuts the time of shipping, the cost of shipping, nearly by half. So the Europeans are coming at an end. The Russian Federation will make money in the future, and the sanctions have an effect. Yes, they have an outcome. They made the Russian economy stronger.
Not quite what we intended, but yeah, there's a time of reckoning that will be coming because it is illogical for these positions that the West is doing to have any kind of a positive outcome. And I guess it's in a perverse sort of way. We have to hope that Russia can somehow avoid an escalation from the West to keep this from blowing up, because then everybody loses for sure. But do you see any path, whether it's from some diplomacy or / military, something from Russia, or maybe even from the voting public in the various European countries? Is there anything that can be done to stop this, what you called transatlantic corrupted elite that seemed to be driving us to the ship of the rocks?
Well, Mr. Putin told us several times two things. The first thing is he didn't want to attack a NATO country. He don't want to do that. And the second point is he's ready to negotiate about a new security system for the whole of Europe, a new pan-European security system. It is the West who doesn't want to negotiate. You can start with negotiation at any time, but the Western countries and the United States will lose this system of a unipolar world led by Washington. This is the point. So we can get back to a multipolar order in Europe with different actors who have to negotiate at all points. And we can stop the enforcement race all over Europe, and we can stop the war in Ukraine. Yes, it's possible. But I think the West doesn't want that. One reason is the eastward enlargement of NATO. And if NATO would declare we step back from Ukraine and we step back our missiles from Poland and Romania, then this is an offer to Mr. Putin to stop this war. And we could reach our economic goals by cooperation with Russia. But this would weaken the influence of the United States in Europe. And that's the reason the West and the arm of America, the NATO, does not want to negotiate.
Well, it's hard to argue with any of that, even though I would love to. But the things are what they are. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons we're grateful to have you on the show, because you just call things out for what you observe on the ground, what people say and what they do, and where this is probably heading. And I really hope that part you're wrong about, because otherwise, you say in sometime in the future, maybe sooner or later, there would be actual war between the two sides. And God help us if that comes to pass, because then it's going to be a calamity and potentially catastrophic loss. We'll just have to wait and see how that happens. But by continuing to be unintimidated and uncompromised to bring the truth, maybe by doing so, we can help enough people, educate them to see what's going on and to get cut through the rhetoric and to see there is a danger here from our side. And maybe we can do something about it. That is certainly the hope. And that's why we're so grateful to you for casting a light on the truth.
I hope I'm wrong as well. Thank you very much.
And we thank you guys for joining us as well. Just a quick reminder, we have Colonel Doug McGregor coming on later today. There's a lot of things going on in the Middle East. He's going to be cutting through the chase on that too. You always want to hear interesting things from Colonel McGregor. He never sugarcoats anything and tells you the truth of whatever that happens to be. Turn in today at 12:30 p.m. That's Colonel Doug McGregor. And we will see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.